Alright, so Divest wants to review, what's the full name? Ippo? Hajime no Ippo. Because we were watching that because basically Germanicus is a big boxing nerd. He's a big fan of boxing. He like watches it with his dad and shit. And we were trying to learn more about boxing. So we'd have something to talk to him about. So we were watching the Hajime no Ippo anime. So it started out really good because it like actually focused on like the lifestyle stuff about boxers and stuff instead of just their fights. Their fights are kind of boring because it's basically just like boxing, but it's super exaggerated, and then because it's shown in anime, it's sort of like, oh, well, this guy had more heart, so he won. And it's like, yeah, I guess. But yeah, so that's how Ippo got through. And then he had his first defeat, and they sort of brushed over that. He just like went back to boxing, and then he got the title by beating a different guy. That wasn't as good at boxing, I guess, would be the assumption. But yeah, it sort of started to drag after the early parts because it was just like, instead of focusing on, because like when Ippo was starting out, because he like didn't have any experience at it or technique as a boxer, they would actually have him like go and adapt to his opponents by learning new techniques and stuff. Then it's just like after like the third or fourth fight, his coach is just like telling him, oh, you know, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You just got to go and make sure that you like believe in yourself or whatever, because there's like nothing else I can do. And so it started to really drag because it's like you have a fight, they introduce the boxer, he doesn't have much personality, or he's got like a one-note personality, and then he like loses to Ippo, or he loses to Takamura. And also like Divest and I both didn't like Takamura. He was annoying. He's got an ugly haircut too, and so it's kind of cringe that he's like the strongest boxer in the world because he's like a bully and a pervert. So, I mean, I guess that's sort of realistic when you have like dudes like Mike Tyson or whatever, but still, he's not a character that either of us liked. And then there were like stupid fights too. Like they had one where there was this guy, and it was like he like had black skin, but he was white, I think, because he was blonde. But you know, it's like that anime thing where they have the guy with the tan skin, but it just looks way too tan. And then he has blonde hair, and then he had like a harem of girls or something like that. And he was talking about breeding with all the Japanese women and shit like that. So that was an annoying fight because they're pointing out, hey, you know, Takamura acts like this too. But then of course Takamura wins because he's Japanese and it's a Japanese anime, and we all know that Americans would win anyways. And then we just sort of skipped the final like 4 episodes of the anime because the final fight that they showed was like this flashback where they went back to like 1947, which would have been interesting because it's like, oh yeah, you have 1947 boxers going at it. But then instead of actually focusing on having like different Japanese guys fighting, based off of, you know, like old like 1947 style boxing where they used different tactics because they had to fight like multiple times a week, and they didn't have like as strong of like gloves to protect their fists and stuff like that, so they needed to minimize damage. Instead of doing any of that bullshit, they have like this snide like U.S. soldier who's like a rapist, and he's like giving out candy to Japanese people to insult them, and then there's this woman who got nuked at Hiroshima, and so she's coughing up blood, even though I don't think that's how that would work if you got radiation poisoning. I think her skin would just be fucked. But of course, she's got beautiful white skin and all this shit. And then he like beats up a bunch of Japanese boxers, and then the Ippo's coach goes and like gets a counterpunch in on him or something and kills him. But it's like we were watching the first episode, and then we're like, oh, what the fuck's going on here? Because he's like giving out candy, and then you have like the Japanese like cut boxers, and they're sitting there like, don't take his candy. He's insulting you. And then you got the Japanese one. He's like, this would ruin me as a Japanese princess. And it's like, okay. So we just skip through it because it's like at that point you know what's going to happen. Or we got to the point where he's like chasing the irradiated bitch, and he's like, I'm gonna fuck her because there's no Japanese fighters that can satisfy my lust for violence. They're like, yeah, boy, this is bad. And so it's like, oh yeah, I wonder if he wins the fight and then he starts going around and raping Japanese girls, or if they stop him. Like, yeah. So we just skipped the last, 3 episodes or whatever of the anime. Apparently, so I read a summary of the manga, and it doesn't get any better. It's just like they meander around going through different fights. Where it's just like, oh, this guy has more heart, so he won the fight. And so they introduce all these other characters. They got a fight going on right now where they have I forget his name, but he uses the same fighting style as Ed from Street Fighter, or the Hitman style or whatever. But he's like fighting a Puerto Rican guy who looks like a JoJo character, because like every anime or every manga, they try and make their characters look like they're from JoJo now. But he's got like the cylinder hair, so that looked really goofy. And apparently he like somehow smuggled a gun into Japan, and he was shooting at stuff to entertain himself while he was waiting for his match, which just sounds really ridiculous. And he's Puerto Rican. That was the other thing I thought was funny. So it would have been cool if they had like Ippo go onto the world stage, and so he faced off with more like boxers from around the world. But for the most part, he's just like facing Japanese boxers, and they don't really have a good grasp of those other cultures or anything like that in the first place. That was actually one of the good fights early in the anime. Was they had the I forget his name, but he's like he's like Ippo's like Sasuke rival type character, where he's like cynical or whatever. He's like the first guy Ippo like actually fights in the boxing ring, but he was in Thailand, I think, one of those Southeast Asian countries, and so he had to get a knockout to win because the decisions would always favor his opponent. So that was a really good fight, because you learned more about the stuff behind boxing instead of just having like generic anime fights where people are punching each other and shit. Divest, you got anything you want to say? Yeah, that's a good point. It'd be funny if instead of actually going and adding this, with like AI text to speech or something, you just leave it completely blank so nobody knows what the fuck you're talking about.